The flames rose 18 inches above the barrel's rim, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls while the temperature outside had dropped to 15 below zero. Caleb Harlan sat 5 feet from the roaring fire in his shirt sleeves, comfortable and warm, while his nearest neighbor, half a mile away, was burning his 4th armload of wood that night and still shivering under 3 blankets. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1839 came early to the Appalachian highlands. By mid-November, snow had already buried the lower trails, and temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before hitting the ground. In a small cabin near the headwaters of the New River, Caleb Harlan woke to find ice crystals spreading across the inside of his window. He could see his breath inside the cabin. The fire in his stone hearth had burned down to ash during the night, and the cold had crept in through every gap in the chinked logs. Caleb was 28 years old that winter, a trapper and hunter who had spent 6 seasons working the high country of what would later become West Virginia. He was competent with rifle and knife, knew how to read weather and animal sign, and had survived situations that killed less careful men. But survival in the mountains wasn't just about outdoor skills. It was about the hours spent inside crude shelters during storms that lasted days, about staying warm when firewood ran low, about making it through brutal nights when the cold became an enemy as dangerous as any bear or mountain lion. He rebuilt his fire that morning using kindling he kept dry near the hearth. The flames caught quickly, but the heat seemed to vanish into the air. His fireplace was typical of mountain cabins, built from field stones with a wide opening and a chimney that drew smoke upward. It worked adequately during moderate weather, but on the coldest nights it was wasteful and inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney. The stones absorbed some warmth and radiated it back, but not enough. On nights like the previous one, Caleb had burned through nearly half a cord of wood and still woke up cold. Other trappers accepted this as normal. Fire was warmth, but fire was also hunger. It consumed wood at a relentless pace. A man could spend half his time cutting and hauling fuel just to survive winter. Some trappers moved to lower elevations during the worst months. Others partnered up and shared cabins to pool resources and body heat. A few simply froze to death when they ran out of wood or couldn't keep their fires going. Caleb had partnered the previous winter with a trapper named Amos Dunbar. Amos was originally from Pennsylvania, 10 years older than Caleb, with experience in the northern mountains. They had built a shared cabin in a hollow protected from the worst winds, trapped beaver and marten together, and survived the cold months by working in shifts to maintain the fire. One man slept while the other tended the flames. It was exhausting but effective. On March 2nd, 1839, Amos went to check their trap line along a creek 3 miles from the cabin. The day was clear and cold. Caleb stayed behind to process pelts from the previous week's catch. Around mid-afternoon, he heard a sound that made him grab his rifle and run toward the door. It was a scream, distant but unmistakable, cut short before it finished. Then silence. Caleb ran toward the sound, following the trail Amos had taken that morning. Caleb found Amos a mile and a half from the cabin, lying in the snow near a frozen creek. The mountain lion had attacked from above, probably from an overhanging rock ledge. Amos's rifle lay 10 feet away, unfired. The attack had been swift and brutal. Amos had died quickly, probably before he even understood what was happening. The cat was long gone by the time Caleb arrived, following its nature to kill and retreat. Caleb buried his partner on a hillside above the creek, piling rocks over the grave to keep scavengers away. He marked it with a split rail he carved from a fallen oak. The work took until dusk. He spoke no words over the grave because he had none that seemed adequate. Amos had been a good partner, fair in dealings, steady in crisis, reliable in the way mountain men measured reliability. Now he was gone, and Caleb was alone. That night, back in the cabin, Caleb couldn't sleep. He kept the fire burning high, feeding it log after log, watching the flames consume wood that had taken him hours to cut and haul. The fire was hungry, always hungry. He thought about Amos, about the scream he had heard, about how quickly a man could die in the mountains. But mostly he thought about the fire and what it demanded. Every 2 hours through the night, he added wood. Every 2 hours he woke from whatever thin sleep he had managed, stumbled to the woodpile, and fed the flames. By morning, he had burned through a quarter cord. The cabin was warm, but the work was endless. One man alone couldn't maintain that pace through an entire winter. He would exhaust himself or run out of wood, and either outcome could be fatal. Caleb realized something that morning that would change everything. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was the fire itself, or more precisely, how the fire was used. The heat went up and out. The stones held some warmth, but not enough. The design was fundamentally wasteful. Every mountain cabin he had ever seen used the same basic approach: a fireplace with a chimney, wide opening, stones for radiation. And every cabin faced the same problem. The fire demanded constant attention and consumed enormous amounts of fuel. He started paying attention to how heat moved. When he stood near the fireplace, he felt warmth on his face and chest, but his back stayed cold. The heat didn't spread through the cabin evenly. It rose straight up and vanished into the chimney. Hot air rose. He knew that. Everyone knew that. But what if there was a way to trap that heat before it escaped? What if the heat could be captured and held, stored somehow, so it would radiate slowly instead of vanishing immediately? These thoughts occupied him through the following weeks. He continued running the trap lines alone, checking sets, skinning catches, preparing pelts for sale. But in the evenings, sitting by his wasteful fire, he thought about heat and metal and stone. He thought about blacksmith forges and how metal held warmth long after the fire died. He thought about Dutch ovens and how they cooked food with stored heat. He thought about the thick iron kettles his mother had used, how they stayed hot for an hour after being removed from the fire. Metal held heat. Stone held heat, but not as well. Wood didn't hold heat at all. It just burned. The fireplace was stone, which helped, but the design sent most heat upward before the stones could absorb it. What if there was more metal? What if the fire was surrounded by metal that could soak up heat and hold it? The idea seemed obvious once he thought of it, but he had no metal. Iron was expensive on the frontier. A cast iron stove cost more than a season's worth of pelts, and even if he could afford one, hauling it into the high country would be nearly impossible. Spring came slowly to the high country. Snow lingered in shaded hollows through April, and the creeks ran high with meltwater. Caleb continued trapping through the season, working alone now, managing trap lines that had been designed for 2 men. The work was harder, but it kept him occupied and away from thoughts about Amos lying under those rocks on the hillside. He visited other trappers when opportunities arose. The mountain community was scattered and sparse, but men crossed paths at certain times and places. Caleb made a point of observing their cabins, their fires, their heating methods. Everyone used the same basic approach: stone fireplaces with chimneys, wide openings, constant feeding of wood. Every cabin was cold in the mornings. Every trapper burned enormous amounts of fuel. He talked to Micah Tate, a trapper who worked territory 15 miles north. Micah's cabin had a particularly well-built fireplace, carefully mortared stones, good draft, efficient design by frontier standards. But Micah still complained about the cold and the endless wood consumption. On the coldest nights, he said, he burned a full cord and still woke shivering. Ephraim Knox had tried a different approach. He had built a small secondary fire pit in the center of his cabin, reasoning that a central fire would radiate in all directions. It did, but it also filled the cabin with smoke unless he left the door partially open, which defeated the purpose. He had abandoned the experiment after 3 days. Levi Boone had insulated his cabin walls with packed clay and moss, creating thicker barriers against the cold. It helped marginally, But the fundamental problem remained. Heat from his fireplace still rose and escaped. His cabin was slightly warmer than others, but he still burned through 3 cords of wood each month during deep winter. Caleb watched and listened and learned. The problem was universal. Everyone fought the same battle against cold and fuel consumption. Some fought it better than others through minor improvements, but nobody had solved it. Heat rose and escaped. Fires demanded constant feeding. Wood was consumed endlessly. These facts seemed immutable, basic laws of mountain survival that couldn't be changed. But Caleb kept thinking about metal and heat storage. He had no access to iron stoves or cast metal, but the idea wouldn't leave him. There had to be something, some way to use what was available. During his visits to other cabins, he paid attention to what metal objects existed. Kettles, a few pots, some had old tools. Nothing large enough or available enough to build a heating system. In late May, he made his annual trip down to the settlements to sell his winter's catch of furs. The journey took 4 days on foot, following creek valleys down from the high country to the lower elevations where small communities had formed around mills and trading posts. He sold his pelts for a decent price, enough to buy supplies for another season. But instead of heading straight back to the mountains, he spent an extra day walking around the settlement, looking at buildings and workshops, studying how people in more civilized places managed heat and construction. The settlement sat in a valley where 3 creeks converged, a collection of rough buildings serving the scattered population of farmers, trappers, and traders. Caleb walked past the general store, the blacksmith's forge, and the mill where farmers brought grain. Behind the settlement's only distillery, he found what would change everything. The distillery produced corn whiskey, a profitable enterprise that supplied the entire region. Behind the building sat a collection of discarded equipment, broken barrels, damaged tools, and refuse from the operation. Among the debris, Caleb noticed a steel drum lying on its side. It was approximately 2 feet in diameter and 3 feet tall, constructed from heavy-gauge metal with visible rivets along its seams and horizontal bands reinforcing the structure. The barrel had a dent along one side and a split seam near the bottom that had rendered it useless for holding liquid. For the distillery, it was trash. For Caleb, it was possibility. He examined the metal carefully. The steel was thick, far heavier than any pot or kettle. The construction was industrial, built to withstand the pressure and weight of hundreds of pounds of liquid. Despite the damage, most of the barrel was intact and solid. He found the distillery owner and offered $2 for the damaged barrel. The man looked at him like he was mad, but accepted the money. Caleb also purchased a cold chisel and a heavy hammer from the blacksmith, tools that cost him another $1 and raised more questions he didn't answer. Other trappers in the settlement that day watched him load the barrel onto a crude travois he built from poles and rope. They asked what he planned to do with it. He said he had an idea but didn't elaborate. The journey back to his cabin took 6 days instead of 4. The barrel was heavy, and dragging it up mountain trails was brutal work. He could only manage a few miles each day, stopping frequently to rest and adjust the travois. Twice the barrel nearly rolled away down steep slopes. Once the travois broke and had to be rebuilt. But Caleb kept moving, driven by the idea that had formed in his mind. He thought about heat and metal and storage. The barrel was steel, thick steel that would absorb enormous amounts of thermal energy. If he could surround fire with that steel, the metal would heat up and hold the warmth. It would become a radiator, a heat battery that could warm his cabin long after the flames died down. The open top that made it useless for liquids could allow fire to burn inside, while the barrel walls captured and stored the heat. Other trappers would think he was insane. They would see a damaged barrel in trash. He saw a solution to the problem that killed men every winter. When he finally dragged the barrel into his cabin clearing in early June, he was exhausted but certain. This would work. He just had to figure out exactly how. Caleb spent the first week of June studying the barrel and planning his approach. The top needed to come off cleanly to create an open fire pit, but the metal was thick, and cutting it would require careful work. He marked a line around the circumference about 4 inches below the barrel's upper rim, giving himself a cutting guide that would leave the walls high enough to contain fire while allowing flames to rise freely. The cutting took 3 weeks. He used the cold chisel and hammer to score the metal, working his way around the barrel in small sections. Each strike of the hammer drove the chisel deeper into the steel. The work was loud, repetitive, and exhausting. His hands blistered, then calloused. The chisel dulled and had to be resharpened repeatedly on a whetstone. But gradually the cut deepened until he could bend the top section back and forth, fatiguing the metal until it separated. When the top finally came free, Caleb examined his work. The cut was reasonably clean, the edges rough but not dangerous. The barrel now had an open mouth approximately 20 inches across. He filed down the sharpest edges and cleaned out metal shavings from inside the drum. The barrel was ready, but it needed a proper foundation. He spent 4 days gathering stones from the creek bed half a mile from his cabin. He selected rocks carefully, looking for pieces that were roughly fist-sized to slightly larger, with irregular shapes that would lock together when stacked. He avoided smooth river stones that might shift under weight. He wanted stones with rough, jagged faces that would create a stable foundation. Back at the cabin, he positioned the barrel where his old fire pit had been, then removed it to build the stone base. He arranged the rocks in a circular ring formation, fitting them tightly together to create a nest that would cradle the barrel's bottom rim. The ring wasn't perfectly geometric. Gaps existed between some stones, small spaces that would allow air to flow underneath the barrel. He built the ring to a height of exactly 3 inches, measuring carefully to ensure the elevation was consistent around the entire circumference. When he set the barrel onto the stone ring, it sat stable and level. The elevation kept the superheated bottom away from the wooden floor, while the gaps between stones would allow cool air to flow underneath, creating circulation that would spread heat throughout the cabin. The system was ready to test. In mid-July, Micah Tate stopped by Caleb's cabin while passing through the area. He saw the barrel sitting on its stone ring in the middle of the cabin floor and stared at it for a long moment. Then he started laughing. He asked Caleb if he planned to burn his cabin down or just fill it with smoke. He said it was the stupidest heating idea he had ever seen. A trash barrel sitting on rocks wasn't a stove. It was kindling, waiting for disaster. Caleb didn't argue. He just said he would see how it worked come winter. October brought the first hard frosts to the high country. Caleb spent September cutting and splitting firewood, stockpiling fuel for the coming winter. He stacked the split logs behind where the barrel sat, close enough for convenient loading, but positioned carefully against the cabin wall. By early October, he had 2 cords of seasoned hardwood ready and his barrel system waiting for its first real test. On the evening of October 9, 1839, Caleb built the first fire inside the steel drum. He started with kindling and small pieces of dry pine, arranging them carefully in the bottom of the barrel. He struck his flint and steel, caught the char cloth, and transferred the ember to the kindling. The fire caught immediately, flames rising inside the barrel and climbing toward the open top. He fed the fire slowly at first, adding progressively larger pieces of wood. The flames grew higher, rising above the barrel's rim. Smoke drifted upward and dispersed near the cabin ceiling before finding its way out through gaps in the roof construction. The draft was good, pulling air into the barrel from below through the gaps in the stone ring and feeding the combustion. Within 30 minutes, the barrel began to radiate heat. Caleb could feel warmth emanating from the metal walls when he held his hand near the surface. The steel was heating up, absorbing thermal energy from the flames inside. He continued feeding the fire, building it hotter, watching as the barrel's exterior changed color slightly from the extreme heat. After an hour, the barrel was almost too hot to approach closely. Heat radiated outward in all directions, warming the entire cabin in a way his fireplace never had. The warmth wasn't directional like fireplace heat that only warmed whatever faced the flames. This heat spread evenly, filling the space. Caleb could stand anywhere in his cabin and feel comfortable. He experimented with fuel, loading through the evening. Too much wood created flames that rose dangerously high and generated excessive heat. Too little allowed the fire to die down before the barrel reached optimal temperature. He learned to maintain a moderate fire that kept the barrel hot without creating waste or danger. The sweet spot seemed to be a steady burn that produced flames rising 12 to 18 inches above the rim. Around midnight, he let the fire burn down to coals and added just enough wood to maintain low flames. Then he went to bed. When he woke 6 hours later, the fire had burned down to ash, but the cabin was still warm. The barrel radiated heat into the space, its steel walls releasing the thermal energy they had stored during the evening's burn. Caleb placed his hand on the barrel's exterior. It was still hot enough that he couldn't keep his palm against it for more than a few seconds. The system worked. A single evening's burn had heated his cabin through the entire night with less wood than he normally used in 3 hours with his fireplace. He had proven the concept. Now he needed to refine the technique. Word spread quickly through the scattered mountain community. By late October, every trapper within 20 miles had heard about Caleb Harlan's barrel fire. The story grew with each telling. Some said he had gone mad with grief after Amos died. Others said he was trying to burn his cabin down for reasons nobody understood. A few claimed he was experimenting with some kind of still or forge, though nobody could explain why a trapper would need either. Micah Tate visited again in early November with Ephraim Knox and Levi Boone. The three men stood in Caleb's cabin staring at the barrel with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Micah walked around it slowly, examining the cut top, the stone ring, the stack of firewood positioned behind it. He shook his head and laughed. He told Caleb it was the dumbest thing he had seen in 15 years of mountain living. All the heat would go straight up and out, he said. An open fire inside a cabin was asking for disaster. One spark on the wooden floor, and the whole structure would burn. The barrel would crack from the heat stress within a month. Even if it somehow worked, which it wouldn't, any fool could see that a proper fireplace was better because at least a fireplace had a chimney to control the smoke. Ephraim agreed. He said Caleb had wasted good money on a damaged barrel and ruined it. Further, by cutting the top off, he could have traded it to someone who needed metal for repairs or tools. Instead, he had created a fire hazard that would either kill him through burns, smoke, or cold when the inevitable failure occurred. Levi was slightly less harsh, but equally skeptical. He asked what advantage Caleb thought this barrel offered over traditional methods that had worked for generations. Everyone used fireplaces because fireplaces worked. Yes, they consumed wood, but wood was free if you were willing to cut it. Yes, they required tending, but that was just part of mountain life. Trying to reinvent heating with trash barrels seemed like effort better spent on productive work. Caleb listened without arguing. He offered to demonstrate the system, but the men declined. They had seen enough. Before leaving, Micah made a prediction. Come January, when the real cold hit, Caleb would abandon his barrel experiment and go back to using his fireplace like a sensible man. Either that, or they would find him frozen because his foolish contraption had failed during a storm. After they left, Caleb split more wood and stacked it carefully. Their mockery didn't bother him. He had expected it. Mountain men were conservative about survival methods because failed experiments in the wilderness could be fatal. They trusted proven techniques and viewed innovation with suspicion. He understood their perspective, but he also knew what he had discovered. The barrel worked better than any fireplace he had ever used. When winter came in full force, he would prove it. December 18, 1839, brought weather that old-timers would talk about for years. A massive cold front swept down from Canada, driving temperatures to levels that killed livestock in the valleys and froze wells solid. In the high country, the cold was murderous. By dusk, the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero and was still falling. Caleb had been watching the weather for 2 days, reading the signs in the sky and wind. He knew brutal cold was coming and prepared accordingly. He brought extra firewood inside, stacking it near the barrel where it would stay dry and accessible. He checked his food supplies, his water containers, his bedding. He sealed gaps around his door and window with extra chinking. Then he waited. At dusk, he loaded the barrel with carefully selected hardwood, pieces of seasoned oak and hickory that would burn hot and long. He built the fire up slowly, feeding it until flames rose 18 inches above the rim and the barrel began radiating intense heat. The cabin warmed quickly, the temperature rising until Caleb had to remove his heavy coat. He maintained the hot fire for 2 hours, superheating the steel until the barrel glowed faintly in the dim light. Around 9 o'clock he reduced the fuel, letting the fire burn down to a moderate level with flames just above the rim. The barrel continued radiating stored heat, warming the cabin from its thermal mass. At midnight, he added another load of wood, built the fire back up for an hour, then let it burn down again. By 1 in the morning, he went to bed with the fire reduced to glowing coals and small flames. Outside, the temperature dropped to 25 below zero. Wind howled through the trees, creating drifts against the cabin walls. It was the kind of night that killed unprepared men, the kind of cold that found every weakness in a structure and exploited it mercilessly. Caleb slept soundly under 2 blankets. The cabin stayed warm through the night, heat radiating from the barrel's steel walls, even as the fire inside died down to ash. When he woke at dawn, he could still see his breath, but the cabin was tolerable. The barrel was still warm to the touch. He had burned perhaps a quarter cord of wood total, loaded in 2 sessions, and maintained comfort through the worst night of the winter. 3 miles away, Micah Tate had burned 2 full cords of wood through the night, feeding his fireplace constantly, and still spent the dark hours shivering under 4 blankets, while his water bucket froze solid 5 feet from the hearth. Ephraim Knox had abandoned his cabin entirely and ridden down to lower elevations when the cold became unbearable. Levi Boone had survived by burning furniture when his firewood ran low, desperately feeding anything combustible into his fireplace to maintain enough heat to prevent freezing. Caleb rebuilt his fire that morning and made coffee. The system had passed its ultimate test. The barrel had kept him alive and comfortable through conditions that had driven other men to desperation. 2 days after the brutal cold snap broke, Micah Tate appeared at Caleb's cabin. He looked exhausted, his face wind-burned, and his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He didn't make jokes this time. He asked quietly if he could see how the barrel system worked. Caleb showed him everything. He explained how the steel absorbed and stored heat during active burning, then radiated it for hours afterward. He demonstrated the stone ring's purpose, how the gaps allowed air circulation that spread warmth throughout the cabin. He described his fuel loading technique, the timing of burns, the balance between superheat and sustained radiation. Micah listened carefully, asking questions about measurements, materials, and construction methods. Micah admitted he had burned through 4 cords of wood during the 3-day cold snap and barely survived. His fireplace had consumed fuel at a devastating rate while providing inadequate warmth. He had spent 72 hours in misery, feeding flames constantly, watching his winter wood supply vanish, and still shivering. Meanwhile, Caleb had been comfortable using a fraction of the fuel. The difference wasn't marginal. It was the difference between survival and suffering. Before leaving, Micah asked where he could find a similar barrel. Caleb told him about the distillery and suggested checking behind industrial operations in the settlements for damaged or discarded drums. He offered to loan his cold chisel and hammer. Micah accepted and left with a list of specifications and techniques written on birch bark. Word spread differently this time. Instead of mockery, there was curiosity. Ephraim Knox visited in early January, asking detailed questions about the stone ring construction. He wanted to know the exact height, the reason for gaps between stones, and how Caleb had calculated the proper elevation. Caleb explained the principles as best he understood them. Cool air flowing under the barrel, heating against the hot metal bottom, rising along the walls, creating circulation. Ephraim took notes and asked permission to replicate the design. Levi Boone came a week later with a barrel he had acquired from a mill, already cut open, asking Caleb to examine it and advise on whether the metal was suitable. Caleb inspected the gauge and construction. The steel was thinner than his own barrel, but adequate if Levi maintained moderate fires rather than superheating it. He helped Levi build a proper stone ring base, teaching him how to select and position rocks for stability and airflow. By late February, 5 trappers in the region had built barrel heating systems based on Caleb's design. Each adapted the basic principles to their specific barrels and cabins, but the core concept remained consistent. Heavy steel drum, cut open top, stone ring base, controlled burning for thermal storage. The results were universal. Dramatic reduction in wood consumption, better heat distribution, ability to maintain warmth through long winter nights without constant tending. Nobody called it Harlan's barrel fire anymore. They just called it the smart way to heat a cabin. Caleb didn't care what they called it. He had solved the problem that killed Amos, the endless fuel hunger that exhausted men and consumed their time. Spring of 1840 brought the usual melt and mud, the retreat of snow from the high country, and the return of trapping season. Caleb worked his lines through April and May, preparing pelts for sale and planning for another year in the mountains. But something had changed in him during that winter. The obsession that had driven him to build the barrel system had faded, replaced by a quieter restlessness. He had solved the problem he set out to solve. The barrel worked. Other trappers had adopted it. Men would survive winters more easily because of what he had discovered. But Amos was still dead, buried under rocks on a hillside, and no innovation could change that. The cabin felt empty in ways the barrel's warmth couldn't fill. In June of 1840, Caleb made his last trip down from the high country. He sold his remaining pelts, his trapping equipment, and his cabin to a younger man just starting out in the mountains. He kept only his rifle, his personal belongings, and the knowledge he had gained. He moved east to the lower valleys, where settlements were growing into small towns. He found work as a carpenter, building homes and barns for farmers expanding into newly opened territory. The work was steady and safer than trapping. In 1842, he married a woman named Rhoda, a farmer's daughter who appreciated his quiet competence and didn't ask many questions about his years in the mountains. They built a small house on land they purchased near a creek. Caleb farmed in the summers and did carpentry in the winters. It was a simple life, far removed from the high country. They had 3 children over the following years. Caleb taught his sons to work wood and build structures, passing on skills but not stories. He rarely spoke about his trapping days or the winters in the mountains. When asked, he said only that he had survived, which was enough. He never mentioned Amos or the barrel or the cold that had driven him to innovation. In 1873, Caleb Harlan died quietly at age 62 from pneumonia that settled in his lungs after a wet autumn. Rhoda buried him in the church cemetery near their home. His children mourned appropriately and settled his modest affairs. To them, he had been a good father and a skilled carpenter, nothing more. None of them knew about the cabin in the high country or the barrel that had changed how men survived winter. But in the mountains, the legacy persisted. Trappers continued using barrel heating systems through the 1850s and 60s. The technique spread beyond the original region, carried by men who moved to new territories and built new cabins using principles they had learned. Some barrels lasted decades, their heat-blackened steel testament to thermal engineering born from necessity and grief, developed through observation and experiment, proven through brutal winter nights.